world of journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm David Reed. When do security concerns trump free speech? When should whistleblowers be sent to jail? When should the journalists who report on their leaks be prosecuted? Is it okay for police to arrest journalists, along with protesters, when the officers are breaking up demonstrations? That last question may be the easiest to answer, but the conflicts between government agents and journalists all relate to recent erosions of press freedoms in the United States. The U.S. plummeted 27 places in the latest Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. The nonprofit group placed the primary blame on the rough treatment of journalists covering the Occupy protests around the country. The arrest of about 25 journalists during public demonstrations also caused the U.S. to drop in the Freedom House press freedom rankings. Our guests today include the director of the Freedom House Index, Karin, Karlekar. Also on the program are Denver Nix, the author of a new book about the source of WikiLeaks, and Jared Malsin, a freelance journalist who was arrested while covering an Occupy Wall Street protest. Welcome to Global Journalist.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Jared was filming protesters being forced out of Zuccotti Park one night last November when he captured his own arrest on video.
I'm a reporter. I'm a reporter. I am a journalist. I'm sorry. I am a reporter. This is my press credential.
Jared, the last sound from that clip seemed to be the sound of handcuffs being tightened. Do you remember what you were thinking at that moment?
Well, I was very startled, really. I couldn't believe that I was under arrest at all. I was standing on the sidewalk filming, and I was clearly identified as a journalist. And I was also doing my best to move away from the confrontation between police and protesters when two police officers grabbed me from behind. So my main thought at that point was that I just couldn't believe that this was happening.
And what's happened with your case?
The charges were dropped.
Okay.
I had to go to court twice in January and March, but the prosecutor ultimately dropped the case.
And there was a class action lawsuit alleging that the New York Police Department used excessive force during the Occupy protests. I understand you weren't involved, but what do you think should be done to prevent this from happening again?
That's right. There's an ongoing court case. There's a lot that's being done right now to advocate for the rights of journalists to report on protests in New York, including that lawsuit, and a number of professional associations. The newspapers themselves, the Columbia School of Journalism, have all sort of approached NYPD and the mayor's office and other relevant authorities to ask them to treat reporters with respect. And I think that's an ongoing kind of negotiation, and there are organizations like the National Press Photographers Association that have been actively working to train police in First Amendment issues. But that day, November 15th, the 24 hours following the police raid on the protest camp in Zuccotti Park, there were at least 11 journalists who were arrested just in New York on that day, and that clearly shows the need for some.
And also there are more protests in May where the police. Did they learn their lesson and not be so rough on journalists at that protest?
That's right. In May, as far as I was able to tell, there were two journalists arrested and one other one in San Francisco that was detained. So that was 3 detentions of journalists across the country as compared to 11 just in New York on one day. And 3, is still probably too many, but I think what that indicated is that some of these departments are maybe a little more circumspect about their treatment of journalists. That doesn't mean that reporters and photographers had an easy time reporting on May 1st. but I think it does reflect some of the conversations that have been happening between professional associations, newspapers, journalism schools, and the police department.
Right. Speaking of professional organizations, Karin, what's your take on the arrests of these journalists?
Well, definitely. I mean, any journalist with credentials, such as Jared had, and some of the other journalists that were arrested in November last year, I mean, they should definitely not be arrested while in the course of, performing their duties, such as covering these protests. And there were, quite a number of outcries from, press freedom organizations within the U.S. about those arrests. And as you mentioned, the U.S. did decline substantially in the Reporters Without Borders Index. We at Freedom House also sort of declined the U.S. score, not quite by as much, but it was we did decline it by 1 point, and the U.S. did drop from being ranked 17th place worldwide to being ranked 22nd place overall. So we did also take account of, these cases. It wasn't, just one or two. There were quite a few over the course of the year. So we definitely thought it was a sort of worrying trend.
And could you put the actions in historical context?
Well, in the U.S., I mean, the U.S. Generally has a very low level of sort of attacks and harassment on journalists, but we do see that, in cases of protests, that has been, I think, less an issue recently, but definitely in years, let's say, when we have sort of political events or conventions, there's a similar treatment of journalists who have tried to be covering sort of political events. So the police, I think, in certain, areas have had a history of rough tactics occasionally against journalists, and we usually do sort of adjust the U.S. score in years where that is a concern.
And Jared, you're reporting now in Cairo the intense conflicts there between different factions, and you also were in the West Bank, and you got deported from the West Bank. So you've seen some pretty rough areas up close recently. How would you put this in context? What the civil disobedience and police actions in the U.S. compared with what's happening elsewhere?
Right. Right. I actually just wanted to go back to one thing real quick before answering that question.
Okay.
Karin raised the issue of credentialing, which I think is actually a really thorny issue in terms of police departments' treatment of journalists. In New York, for example, the NYPD press pass, which is the only credential that they recognize, is an incredibly difficult document to obtain. And my press credential that I was wearing when I was arrested was actually one that was issued by the United Nations for a different assignment because I didn't qualify for the NYPD one under their restrictions. It's an incredibly complex issue. There are very few online publications that receive credentials.
Yeah, Karin, I'd like you to chime in on that issue too, because I think your report gets into that a bit about the changing nature of journalism and the more citizen journalists.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to add to that as well. I mean, I think there are probably more clear guidelines in cases where a journalist does have sort of credentials or press passes, and the different types of passes is another issue altogether, and the fact that that it may be very difficult for people to receive those types of credentials. So I think that's a very valid concern that Jared's raised. But definitely, I think with this trend towards more citizen journalism, more freelance journalists, it's even more complicated because many of those people are covering events such as these as journalists and are reporting on the issues, and really have even less protection than a journalist with any type of pass or credentials. So in these types of cases and in other attempts by journalists to cover certain events, I think that's a sort of ongoing and evolving dispute, but it's been raised in a number of other settings as well, including the ongoing debate over protection of sources legislation in the U.S. And sort of the definition of who is a journalist. So that is something that's quite difficult, and it sort of really comes to the fore in cases like this, where journalists really have to be trying to show a pass in order to not be arrested at a protest.
Right. Now, that brings us on to the next two free press issues that we're digging into today. The Obama administration's unprecedented crackdown on security leaks and the administration's support for provisions in a new counterterrorism law that are being harshly condemned by journalists. The title of the recently published book by Denver Nix is Private. The subtitle is Bradley Manning, WikiLeaks, and the Biggest Exposure of Official Secrets in American History. So Denver, you're saying this is bigger than the leak of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg that essentially ended the Vietnam War and President Johnson's bid for a second term. How do you justify that subtitle?
Yeah. I mean, objectively, it is much bigger than the Pentagon Papers, just in terms of the amount of documents.
The volume, yeah.
The volume of documents involved in the leak. It does happen that the Pentagon Papers were classified at a higher level than the documents that Bradley Manning is on trial for leaking. But the amount of documents that were leaked in this situation is far greater than anything ever before. And importantly, it's too often unsaid, the fact that the documents were searchable, that they came digitized, and that scholars would not have to pore over them for months to cull information from them, made them all the more significant.
And so let's bring people up to date on what's happening with the case. Last Friday, a military judge refused to dismiss any of the 22 counts against Manning. The young soldiers accused of aiding the enemy and violating the Espionage Act by providing WikiLeaks with diplomatic cables, military field reports, and war videos. In your opinion, Denver, is he a traitor or a whistleblower who sought to expose wrongdoing?
Well, you know, I find the terms traitor and I mean, most often the sort of dichotomy is traitor and hero, and I find those to be profoundly non-useful terms.
It was a bit of a provocative question. So.
Yeah, I know, no doubt. I mean, and I see what you're getting at, but I'll just answer provocatively and say I think that's nonsense. Bradley Manning. I mean, it depends on what is a whistleblower? Is a whistleblower somebody who feels that they saw wrongdoing and released secret information or told the public about information that they weren't authorized to in order to correct something they perceived to be a wrong? Well, then absolutely Bradley Manning's a whistleblower. I mean, he fits that definition without question, based on my research on his life and situation. Yeah, so I mean, he's a whistleblower by that definition, certainly. To call him a traitor, I think, is well, it's a. You can call somebody a lot of things, but that accusation is, once taken apart, it becomes meaningless in a lot of instances. This in particular, I mean. One thing we know for certain is that Bradley Manning if he did what he's accused of doing, that Bradley Manning did it because he thought he was doing the right thing for the good of his country.
You've gotten to know him pretty well in researching this book and talking with him a great deal. Tell us why you really believe that his motivations were so pure.
Well, it's patently clear from my research and my reporting process. Bradley Manning comes from a small town in rural Oklahoma. While there, he was a notably precocious kid who expressed interest at a really early age in joining the military. And as a teenager, sort of oscillated between, as teenagers do, between criticism of the Iraq War, which was going on as he was becoming a teenager, and a sort of neoconservative idea of how foreign policy should be run. The notion that the United States has a moral responsibility to exert its power abroad to protect human rights. Bradley Manning's a very thoughtful guy. He's very intelligent. He's not prone to a wholesale ideological position. He's certainly not a pacifist. And one of the things that I used in my reporting process were extensive chat logs between Bradley Manning and a very close friend of his over the 2 years or so leading up to his deployment in Iraq and into his time in Iraq. Those chat logs, which are a remarkable record of conversations between confidants, in his chat logs, Brad talks about feeling conflicted about what he's seeing in Iraq, and he talks about He talks about primarily feeling conflicted about the gap between what he sees as an intelligence analyst in Iraq and what he reads in the news. It seems clear to me that based on the things that Bradley Manning himself has said in those and other chat logs, that he was most troubled by that gap. He was most troubled by the secrecy with which American foreign policy was conducted, and that sense of outrage or moral indignation led him, if he did, to making this, astounding amount of classified information.
Now, I want to broaden the topic a bit because we're going to, after the show, continue our interview with Denver and post the extended interview on our website. And I want to remind everyone that you can view or listen to this program anytime by downloading our podcasts at globaljournalist.org. You also can find interesting articles, photos, and interviews related to our program on our website. Please send us questions or comments via globaljournalist@kbia.org or our Facebook page. You can also follow us on Twitter at GJJournalist. At GJJournalist. Karin, the first sentence of the Freedom House report on freedom of the press says WikiLeaks triggered, quote, major debates over the ability of democracies to take legal action against those responsible for leaked information and against media that publish such information. In the court of public opinion, which side's winning the debate so far, in your opinion?
Well, as you said, I think this was a very difficult case, and there was talk about prosecuting WikiLeaks itself. That is obviously quite difficult because it is a sort of international organization with no base, and there were these attempts to sort of shut down on the web the channels by which people were getting information and things like that. But I think it's still an ongoing debate. I mean, as you know, the Manning case is sort of ongoing. But I think it's the U.S. got a lot of bad press for their attempts to try and prosecute both him and WikiLeaks, and I don't know that was really the right approach because it looked fairly vindictive. On the other hand, I think there is a responsibility by groups such as WikiLeaks to be a little bit more responsible about, let's say, the information that they then publish if they are getting information that's been given to them by whistleblowers. We had a number of concerns about the fact that, let's say, very sensitive information about journalists, about human rights defenders in various countries was being exposed through the leak of the State Department cables, for example. And that's sort of an ongoing issue where journalists' lives in other countries have been put at risk by the leak of this information. So I think it's a very delicate issue, but I don't think the U.S. government came out sort of on top with the. It looked like they were being fairly vindictive in the way they went after WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and things like that.
Right. And Denver, you put this issue in broader context in a piece you wrote in the Daily Beast recently. Can you talk about that?
Can you be more specific?
Well, you talked about the how the overclassification of documents in some ways is the root of the problem that we're.
Oh, right. There's a sort of baby in the bathwater dilemma at work in the WikiLeaks situation. There is no question that a lot of the information. One of the most remarkable things about this quantity of information WikiLeaks released in 2010 is that most of it is profoundly boring. It's the sort of daily reports from the field in Afghanistan and Iraq, or the State Department cables are substantially more interesting, but even those, many of them, are just sort of off the cuff, or they're just sort of daily reports filed by State Department officials that are not they're not incendiary, and they don't reveal anything sensitive, and they don't reveal anything outrageous for that matter. There was information, however, that revealed that there was information revealed that was, incendiary, like the Frago 242, I think it's called, order, in which American soldiers were ordered to ignore torture undertaken by the Iraqi army. So anyway, you have this dilemma where there's information contained in the State Department cables, for example, that is not particularly sensitive. But there was information in there also, including the identities of sources for State Department officials, journalists operating in countries with serious press freedom problems, that should not have been, that the release of which put people in danger. There's information, there's sort of a mix of information that's harmless, some of it's harmless, and some of which is harmful. And when you have so much of it, it's difficult to keep track of.
What's Manning think about the way those documents were released, including some of the Julian Assange is accused of putting people's lives in danger for recklessly releasing some of this information. Did Manning expect these people who are reporting on these documents to be more responsible?
There's no indication that he did or did not. In the public record, there's nothing to indicate what Bradley Manning thought about that issue, though I would hasten to add that while there is some evidence of people being put at some degree of risk and inconveniences for State Department officials, there's been a lot of talk about the immense amount of damage that has been done by WikiLeaks. Very, very little of it has been specific. And that, in fact, is one of the pertinent issues right now in Bradley Manning's court-martial. One of the things that, in this most recent hearing, his defense team was pressing for, and it looks like they probably achieved, was for the release of internal agency reports, damage assessments, to determine sort of what damage was done by WikiLeaks. Reports out of the State Department, out of the CIA, sort of classified internal reports to determine what damage was done. And the prosecution team has fought hard to prevent the release of those documents. The thought is that they may reveal what a number of officials have said, which is that, in fact, the release of these documents was, by and large, harmless.
Okay. Let me. We have just about 2.5 minutes left. I wanted to get to the last question I have, and it regards the Obama's zero tolerance for whistleblowers. Basically, 6 whistleblowers now have been prosecuted under the Espionage Act since Obama took office, and that's more than under all the previous administrations combined. Denver and then Karin, what's going on here? Why is this happening?
Well, that's the multi-million-dollar question. One of the issues is that we have more things classified. One of the issues is that it's easier to track down leakers of information now. The digital trail that's left when somebody leaks information just makes it easier to find them. That's certainly one of the problems.
And Karin, what are your thoughts?
Well, it did come as a surprise to us. We did, that the fact that Obama is sort of even more zealous than Bush at going after whistleblowers and sort of continuing to go after journalists on these protection of sources cases. One of the other main cases that we've noted is that of James Risen, who is being sort of under investigation for potentially, a book about Iran's nuclear program and about his sources. So, positively, I think although the Justice Department has been really, really aggressive at pursuing these cases, federal judicial authorities have sort of been pushing back against other branches of the government. So I think it's an ongoing issue in the U.S. with different branches of the government. Sort of, one branch is pushing to go after these. to go after whistleblowers and journalists on protection of sources, and then the higher judiciary is sort of shutting down those attempts to charge journalists. So I think it's an ongoing debate, but it did come a bit as a surprise to us.
Right now, and the federal judge recently threw out the provision of the National Defense Authorization Act that a group of journalists and activists found might chill free speech. But we've come to the end of this week's edition of Global Journalist, produced by the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. Our guests today were author Denver Nix, freelance journalist Jared Malsin, and Karin Karlekar of Freedom House. Our program is directed by Travis McMillan, audio by Pat Akers. Raymond Tungakar is our executive producer. David Cawthon was our lead producer. Now stay with us for Free Press Watch and join us again next week for another Global Journalist. I'm David Reed.
And now, Free Press Watch, a segment on Global Journalist, where each week we bring you a rundown of major events affecting press freedom around the world. I'm Regina Wang. Today's news comes from The Guardian, The Washington Post, and the International Press Institute. An Israeli journalist will be charged with illegal possession of classified information. Yuri Blah, an investigative reporter for the Tel Aviv daily Haaretz, could face up to 7 years in prison. In 2008, an Israeli soldier gave Blah 2,000 documents that she copied while working as a clerk for a top general. Based on these documents, Blah wrote an article on how Israeli military and security officials ignored a Supreme Court order and decided to kill Palestinian militants. After the article was published, Anat Kam, the soldier who gave Blah the documents, was convicted of leaking the information and sentenced to prison for 4.5 years, according to The Guardian. A Mexican journalist is reported missing with her 2-year-old son. Hipatia Stefania Rodriguez Cardoso disappeared from her home on June 8th. Cardoso is a crime reporter for the Zocalo Saltillo newspaper in the state of Coahuila. She and her son were last seen at a celebration for Freedom of Expression Day. Family members found her home in disarray, her camera smashed, and her car missing. A director of the International Press Institute expressed concern for Cardoso's safety. While the reason for her disappearance is not yet known, Mexican journalists, particularly those who cover organized crime and police activity, are being targeted because of their work with chilling frequency. 5 journalists have been murdered in Mexico since April 28th. For more information on these and other events affecting press freedom around the world, please visit our website at globaljournalist.org. Thank you for joining us this week. I'm Regina Wang. See you next week.